All right, we kind of left off basically skimming over Leviticus chapter 7. And we talked about the fact that all throughout here we've got the law of sin offerings, the law of trespass offerings, the law of peace offerings. Over and over and over, we've got very specific details, God instructing these people how to set themselves apart, to not just be clean, but eventually the priests have to be holy. Give me a physical difference between a church building today and the tabernacle setting back then.
A physical difference?
Yes.
Well, church building has a foundation. It doesn't move anywhere. Size.
Okay.
Anybody can enter it.
Anybody can enter it. There you go. What else?
It has no significance in the place such as it did then. I mean, it was known, it was holy at that time because God dwelt within it. Where today the people, I say it was holy at that time because God dwelled in it, and today the building has no significance.
Right, exactly. What about the main way they worshiped versus what we do today?
I was going to say the center of the tabernacle was the main focus of that was the altar, and a church building, your pulpit's in the big thing.
Okay.
The bloodless blood, not worship services today.
Thank you. That was one of the main things I was trying to get you guys to is guys, can you imagine the line of animals that, the parade, the constant parade of animals, the stench? It was just a totally different atmosphere. And I think oftentimes as New Testament Christians, we don't really appreciate the fact that we have the ability to go into a very, what I would call clean and sterile building, sing praises, pray to God, hear something from His Word, participate in the Lord's Supper, give of our means, in a very formal setting, whereas back then, how many of those, as we call them, acts of worship took place? Deathly silence. None. I mean, think about it. They didn't observe the Lord's Supper. It wasn't instituted. Did they give of their means? Well, okay, you could say they gave of their firstborn or whatever. So maybe I'll give you a partial on that one. Do we have record of them singing at the tabernacle?
Not a record.
No. What about preaching? No. I mean, this was literally a Band-Aid to try to atone for sin, is what it was. And so, I think in order for us to really appreciate what we're doing today, we've got to appreciate what they were doing back then. Look at chapter 8 with me. Chapter 8, we start seeing the priests sanctified or separated or consecrated, however you want to say it. Aaron and his sons. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Take Aaron and his sons with him, and the garments, the anointing oil, a bull as a sin offering, 2 rams, and a basket of unleavened bread. Gather all the congregation together at the door of the tabernacle meeting. So Moses did as the Lord commanded him. The congregation was gathered together at the door of the tabernacle meeting. Moses said to the congregation, This is what the Lord commanded to be done. Moses brought Aaron and his sons and washed them with water. He put on a tunic, girded him with sash, clothed him with the robe, put an ephod on him, girded him with the intricately woven band of the ephod, and with it tied the ephod on him, put the breastplate on him. I mean, all of a sudden, we have gone from the patriarchal age, a history in which God is speaking to people directly, a time in which there was not a structured worship setting, to now all of a sudden we've got the priestly nation, the priestly order set up, and a very ordered structure for worship. So in your mind, in your Bible, you need to kind of designate chapters 8 and 9 as the beginning of the priestly ministry. This is when everything is this is basically a new chapter in paying homage to God. In fact, if you look in chapter 9, verse 23, Moses and Aaron went into the tabernacle meeting, came out, blessed the people, then the glory of the Lord appeared to all the people, and fire came out from before the Lord and consumed the burnt offering and the fat on the altar. When all the people saw it, they shouted and fell on their faces. So it's kind of opening day of the new arena. And all of a sudden, we've gone through all, you guys have all seen, like, for instance, in Texas, they've got the new stadium. All the hoopla that surrounds when they open something like that. Well, here you've got opening day of the tabernacle. And even though there aren't any jumbotrons, it's still a pretty big deal. I would point out, by the way, if you go back to chapter 8, it says, gather all of the congregation together at the door of the tabernacle of meeting. One of the things that you're going to notice time and time again in the book of Leviticus, in the book of Deuteronomy, is when God called for these people, in every instance, there's not a single instance where we see him saying, separate the children from the adults. Leave the children at home, or do something else with the children, or put them in children's worship. It was always the family there together. Everybody together. Bring them to me to hear my law, to hear my word. That's an important thing. It's an important concept that we need to start getting across to people is, even though a lot of folks think we need to have all kinds of crazy separate worships and things, ironically, when you look in the Old Testament, God did it pretty effectively by saying, bring the families here, or bring the people here. Chapter 10. Chris, you got a question?
Yeah, he was talking about bringing all the people. I mean, you're talking millions of people.
Yeah.
Do they have representatives? Were the priests themselves not representatives?
Absolutely.
So you didn't actually have all the people.
What do you mean? Say that again.
Well, you didn't have 2 million people standing right outside the area of the tabernacle or wherever.
But you would have them from the camp commence towards the tabernacle.
Okay.
So you've got a tabernacle that is surrounded by all of the people to see what's going on. I mean, you think about it this way, Chris. You're fixing to watch fire literally come down and consume things. God is going to take his seat in the holiest of holies. Don't you think everybody in the camp at that point wanted to see that? And this is the first time that God is going to take his position. And it's just like anything else in modern times. If in Nashville, Tennessee, they said, hey, there's going to be this big XYZ thing happen that is going to be the first time and it's a massive thing, can't you just envision people basically swarming that particular area to kind of get a bird's eye view of what's going on?
I mean, I can.
And
I can imagine people wanting to, but I can't imagine 2 million people.
You can't imagine 2 million people seeing it?
Well, I mean, we can only get to in the Vol Stadium, 130,000 people, and yet, it's built specifically to hold that many people. I mean, and that's just
right.
That's less than 10% of 2 million people. I mean, multiply it by, however many and get your 2 million. I don't know.
Right,
I'm sure.
But remember this. You're talking about an encampment kind of setting. And are they going to be able to see everything? Absolutely not. But it's kind of, this is a very crude and a very a weak analogy. But think about the 4th of July in a major city. It doesn't matter where you are. As long as you are in that region, you're going to see the fireworks. Are you not?
Yeah.
Same kind of thing going on here. You're going to see the fireworks as long as you are congregated in that general vicinity. And I think that's what was going on here.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I guess I was just trying to differentiate between, those who represented the people and
Yeah,
and the people themselves.
you're not going to get a first row seat by any means, or a backstage pass or anything like that. But, understand that this was the beginning, the dawning of a new era for them. This initiated a way for them to atone for sin like they had never had before. So the people obviously were interested in how we're going to do this, what's going to happen, is it going to happen? So you've got people who are flocking to a central area where this tabernacle was. God comes down, he consumes things through fire. They're able to see this pillar of fire, the smoke go up, and they realize we're under a new era. Chapter 10 is an important chapter. Then Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, each took his censer, put fire in it, put incense on it, offered profane fire before the Lord, which he had not commanded them. So fire went out from the Lord, devoured them, and they died before the Lord. Somebody tell me, what is the significance of this?
And
Right.
in modern times, entering unknown or foreign things into our worship, things that aren't necessarily ordained.
Give me an example.
Mechanical instruments of music.
Hey, I don't have any problem with them as long as they stay outside the building.
So said John.
That's what, believe it or not, that's actually what John Wesley said. He said something to the effect of, I don't have a problem with a piano as long as it is neither heard nor seen inside the building.
So did Charles Spurgeon, didn't he?
I think so. What else? What are some other things that are being introduced? Yes, Keely?
God provided the fire that they were supposed to use, and
Okay.
they were, that's all in the same market, I guess. They were providing something that God did not provide for them.
That's a good point. What about the whole idea that, guys, do you realize Nadab and Abihu, they were the sons of Aaron? What does that tell you?
They were respected. People looked up to them.
Is anybody too important to sidestep God's commands? No, Ruba Shelley is not too important.
That microphone is great.
Yes, it is. He may think he is, but guys, in all seriousness, here you've got the sons of Aaron, and yet because they disobeyed, they paid with their life. Now, obviously, you can imagine what that's doing to Aaron. Think about being Aaron. And here you've been consecrated, you got this new tabernacle, and your boys take it upon themselves to do something outside the natural order of what they should have been doing. They pay for their life. Number one, that's going to, if I were Aaron, I'd be like, you know what, I'm not really sure I'm cut out to be a preacher. Or the other natural response would be to get mad at who? God. And yet, Moses steps in verse 3. Moses said to Aaron, this is what the Lord spoke, saying, by those who come near me, I must be regarded as holy, and before all the people, I must be glorified. So Aaron held his peace. What are some other things that are being introduced into the church today that are kind of examples that as far as introductions that we don't have biblical grounds for?
Women, leaders, deacons.
Okay. We got women who are waiting on the table. We got, in some places, we got women elders. What else?
I would say praise teams. Something that's
Okay.
questionable.
Yeah, that's questionable. At least I don't find that term in my Bible. What else? Guys, these are things that y'all need to be aware of. If y'all are like sitting in some dark hole in Denver, you got to get out of the hole, and you got to realize that going on in churches all around you, there are things like praise teams, obviously. But more than that, there's a lot of little programs that we are basically stealing from denominations, and we're trying to employ these programs in hopes that we build up our numbers. Guys, is God worried about numbers? What's he really worried about?
Holiness.
Hearts. We've been talking about holiness, obedience. He wants us to do things his way. And so if you guys go to a congregation and you've got a group of deacons saying, hey, what we want to do is we want to start this new circus campaign out in the front lawn. Here's what we're going to do. Every Saturday we're going to have a circus. Well, that may sound all great and good, but ultimately we got to ask ourselves, does God have a plan, and does the plan work? And the answer is yes, he's got a plan. The plan does work. It's worked for 2,000 years. We don't need to impose on that plan and think that we're smarter than that plan and use denominational tactics just to try to increase numbers. Now, do I want to increase the church? Absolutely. But am I willing to compromise what's going on to do it? Now, Chris.
Are the tactics necessarily what's wrong, or is it the fact that when we use those tactics, we don't follow up on with proper biblical teaching? Follow up on teaching them, because if you're going to talk about tactics, a lot of the tactics that are described in the Bible that we use today to draw people in are like Vacation Bible School.
Right. I would say it's equal. You said, are the tactics wrong, or is it the follow-up that's wrong? Some of the tactics I think are okay, but I think there are some that are not okay. I think there are some tactics that are just absolutely entertainment, for lack of a better term. When you really look at what we're doing, I'll give you an example. And if you guys participate in this, understand, I'm just laying it out there. There are a lot of congregations who are, for instance, having bunco night. It's a card game or some kind of game. And they say, hey, well, we're going to have ladies to get together and play this card game. Well, ultimately, we got to kind of step back and ask ourselves, what is that for? And the common defense would be, well, that's for fellowship, getting together. Well, the reality is, folks, we can get together in fellowship for all kind of reasons. So is that particular method good in the sight of God? Are we actually glorifying God in any way by doing that? I would say not really. I don't see how that glorifies God. I think it edifies each other. I think that's basically what we're doing, is we're kind of looking internally. But I think Chris made a good point in that even though some of these things are not wrong, let's say we have a community day where we have different things, invite the community in, and we do all kind. Part of the problem is we're not following up. We're not using that as a true opportunity to say, hey, we got a sin problem, and here's your answer to your sin problem. Yes, sir.
If just an example, like the card game, if you're going to go that route, say potluck could be the same?
Potluck being the same.
Well, what I mean is just getting together in fellowship, but...
Well, do we have biblical example of New Testament Christians getting together, breaking bread together, eating together?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And do I think that part of what the church should be about is celebrating each other's joys and sharing each other's tears? Absolutely. I think we have biblical example that we are to be family. And I think the elders, part of the problem we have in the church today is that a lot of elderships do not know their flock. And so I call them boardroom elders versus coffee table elders. There's a difference. Boardroom elders say we're running a business, we may have to buy a new air conditioner and pave the parking lot. Coffee table elders are men who look at you and say, have you grown spiritually this year? Where are your children? Why are they acting this way during a worship setting? Why don't your children sing? You know, these are men who are concerned about people's souls. Now, fellowship meal, you know, I don't think we're not going to sit here and just say this one's right, this one's wrong, this one's right, this one's wrong. But I can see how a fellowship meal among the saints is a positive thing, and that we get to know the family. We get to actually spend time together, and we have a biblical example of people doing that. They continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine, breaking bread together. Yeah. We have an example for that.
No, I agree with you. I was just saying that because there are those who question that.
Well, there's folks who would question even having a kitchen on, you know, as a part. You guys will run into congregations who have they've basically drawn lines of fellowship over whether or not you can have a kitchen that's attached or not attached. And I'm not, you know, that's one of those things I'm not going to split hairs about. You guys may be on one side of the fence or the other. That's fine. I'll respect it. But I think eating meals together is not, it definitely can't be a wrong thing since we have a biblical example of it. And I think it's something that realistically we need to do more of. One of the things that hurts me personally in the church is whenever you ask somebody, hey, how are you doing? What's the response you get? If you ask somebody at Bear Valley Sunday, how are you doing? What are you going to hear?
Good or fine.
I'm fine. Let me ask you, do you honestly think out of 300 people in a congregation that everybody is really fine? No, they're not fine. You got people who are going through marriage crisis, and nobody knows it because we don't know each other. You got people whose children are falling away, and they're worried about it. You got people whose children are going through some relationship problems. You got people who are suffering from internet pornography. You got people who are addicted to alcohol and drugs. You got all these different things that are going on underneath the current, and yet we look at each other every Sunday and we say, I'm fine. Everything's fine. I'm good. How about you? Yeah, all right. And we really don't even expect them to say anything. Because if they do, that means we've got to actually stop and address what they're saying. We use the phrase, hey, how are you doing, more as a greeting than to really find out about people. And that's a travesty. Any other comments, questions, thoughts? Yes, Chris.
Something that I hesitate to bring up, but I just kind of want your opinion about it. Offering a strange fire. Let me see if I can word this correctly. I've thought a lot about communion being served at PM services. And I'm not going to say that in itself that it's wrong, although, you know, the real example that we have is we all gather together at one time, and we don't wait. I mean, we wait for everyone to make sure that they're there. So the assumption is if they can't make it, then there's a good reason why they can't make it. And I'm afraid that what we have portrayed over the last 40 or 50 years that the communion in the evening has been offered is that there are reasons that you can miss on Sunday morning, or you can miss the services, because then you can come back a little bit later on. And it could be for work. It could be that you're going to go to a ball game. It could be for various things other than what I feel is really scriptural, which is, you know, you can't make it because you're sick. I don't know if there's anything else that makes it okay for you to miss.
Yeah, let me say it up front that I recognize this is definitely a rabbit trail that we could spend a long time on, so I won't do that. But and this is my opinion. Everybody understands we've all got opinions, and they're all worth basically the same. But I do think that in the church, oftentimes we do not handle communion at night in a proper fashion. I don't know if the answer is completely abandoning it, but I do know that by sending people out of the assembly, down a hall, into a separate room, you're no longer a family. You're no longer a group of saints assembled. What we've done is we've said, okay, because of expediency, we're going to send you down the hall into this classroom that we use to do that. And basically, to me, that's more of a mechanical going through the motions thing than it is truly as a family of believers observing the Lord's Supper. I don't have the answer to it. I've seen congregations do all kind of things where, for instance, they will keep people in the setting. In the evening service, they'll have people stand up who did not participate that morning. And that may seem better because you're at least still in the group. But there again, like Chris said, are we to just open that up carte blanche to everybody? Good question. You know, that's something that I hope you guys will think about and study on before you leave Bear Valley, because that's something you're going to face a lot. It's a little bit of a frustration to me when I see, 30 or 40 people stand up and go out into a hallway, and I'm thinking, okay, number one, where were you this morning? Number two, why are we separating ourselves? Because those are my brothers and sisters, and they're leaving. So, all right, Leviticus chapter 11. Actually, now let's go back to Leviticus 10. I want to read this. Leviticus chapter 10, starting in verse 8. Conduct prescribed for priests. It says, the Lord spoke to Aaron, saying, do not drink wine or intoxicating drink, you nor your sons with you, when you go into the tabernacle of meeting, lest you die. And it shall be a statute forever throughout your generations, that you may distinguish between holy and unholy, between clean and unclean, that you may teach the children of Israel all the statutes which the Lord has spoken to them by the hand of Moses. Moses spoke to Aaron. He spoke to his sons who were left, take the grain offering that remains of the offering made by fire to the Lord. Eat it without leaven beside the altar, for it is most holy. You shall eat it in a holy place, because it is your due and your son's due of the sacrifices made by fire to the Lord. For so I have commanded. The breast of the wave offering, the thigh of the heave offering, you shall eat in a clean place, you and your sons. He is giving specific instructions for the priest. But I find it very interesting that what's his very first thing that he's saying here? Don't do what?
Don't drink alcohol.
Don't drink alcohol. Or don't get drunk. Don't drink wine or intoxicating drink. Why? He gives you the reason. He's saying you need to be able to distinguish between clean and unclean. You need to be able to know which sacrifices are right and which ones are wrong. And I would throw that out just as a charge to you guys. There's a lot of controversy in the church about whether or not you can have drinking or social drinking, or if you're an elder or little wine or a lot of wine or whatever. But I think this is a good example for us to learn from, in that God expects people who are doing his work to have a clear mind and to be able to distinguish between holiness and not holiness. And even in the New Testament, as preachers of the gospel, we need to have a clear mind to be able to preach and teach the truth. Amen. Chapter 11, we start getting into foods that are permitted and forbidden. Any comments before we move on to 11?
I just think it's interesting that it mentions so that people will be able to distinguish who they are. Let's see, where was that? That was in, I lost it.
Verse 10.
Yeah, verse 10. It says that, so you make a distinction between, no, that's not the one I was, oh yeah. But some people noticed that they were different.
Yes. Let's see. Probably verse 11. And that you may teach the children of Israel all the statutes of the Lord. Probably verse 10, I guess.
Yeah, it must have been. Sorry.
But yeah, I mean, over and over again, it's that concept of remaining clean and trying to strive towards holiness. I think we have lost some of that in the church today. I think, when you look at how people act towards God, towards worship in general, the idea of reverence is kind of a foreign thing today. And I think if you really read what's going on here, he is saying you need to be different, you need to be set apart, you need to be reverent, and you need to remember why you're doing what you're doing. Chapter 11, he starts on the foods, and obviously some of these we understand fully today. Some of them we maybe don't understand fully today. and that's all right, guys. There's not a problem with looking somebody in the eye and saying, I'm not 100% sure why he didn't want us to eat these certain foods or these certain meats. Like, for instance, if you look down through there, he starts out by talking about generalities. He says, among the animals, whatever divides the hoof, have cloven hooves, chews the cuds, that you can eat. So, automatically, right off the bat, what are some animals that chew the cud that have cloven feet?
Cow.
Cows. You can eat a cow. He says, you want a steak? You can have a steak. But then he starts getting a little more specific. He says, okay, nevertheless, here are some animals that do that I don't want you to eat. He starts out with this, the rock hyrax, which is very, very similar. It's an animal very similar to a rabbit. If you've ever seen one, you kind of know they are a kind of a cross between a nutria and a rabbit, would be the easiest way for me to describe it. Verse 6, he talks specifically about the hare, the rabbit. Verse 7, the swine, though he divides the hoof, be cloven-footed, yet he cheweth not the cud. He is unclean to you. What do we know today about pigs?
They eat anything.
Very good.
They eat anything.
They often carry trichinosis.
Right, they have parasites called Trichinella spiralis, the cause of trichinosis. So even though back then they didn't have a microscope and they couldn't physically see a parasite, God is already giving these people instruction of how to keep healthy. You know, there was probably some people that looked at that and said, wait a second, I like barbecue, pork in the ground tastes really good. God says, I don't care. This is to keep you clean and different. Moving on, he starts talking about fish. Now, ironically, as you read down through there, he is very specific about what types of fish they can and can't eat. And he says you can eat anything with fins and scales. One of the things about poisonous fish is most of those things in the ocean that have a poison to them, the one thing they don't have is fins and scales. You look, starting in verse 13, and he starts outlining birds. He mentions kite, the falcon, the eagle, the vulture, the buzzard, the ostrich, owls, stork, heron. What are most of those birds that I mentioned initially? What do we consider those? They're predatory birds. So why do you think, what is a rational conclusion of why he would outlaw buzzard, the falcon, the vulture, the eagle, the kite, the falcon, the raven?
Very unclean diet.
Yeah, they feast on dead carcasses. So do you want to eat the meat of an animal that eats dead animals full of bacteria? No, absolutely not. Because what you're going to be doing at that point is introducing some serious bacteria into your diet. Let's see. Verse 21. Somebody read me verse 21.
Yet these may ye eat of every flying, creeping thing that goeth upon all four, which have legs above their feet, to leap withal upon the earth.
Okay. I'm going to go back and pick up verse 20. All the flying insects that creep on all fours shall be an abomination to you. How many legs do insects have?
6.
6. Somebody looks at this and says, Brad, you got a little problem. Because insects have 6 legs, the Bible says 4. Obviously, this is wrong, or the inspired writers don't have a clue. Somebody give me what you think is a proper response to that.
Well, if you did find an insect with 4 legs, I'd be pretty scared to eat it.
Okay.
It says that the insects were walking on 4, but they could have 2 that they weren't walking with.
Exactly. If you study insects, what you learn is most of them truly do use 4 for walking, and 2 for leaping or jumping or basically getting them out into the air. So ironically, the biblical writer is more accurate than we are, that we think we are, in that when you look at the way an insect propels itself, it uses 4 to crawl around, and those other 2 are primarily for propulsion up into the air, to either jump, leap, etc. Which, when you look at the next verse, 21, it says, "Yet these you may eat of every flying insect that creeps on all 4. So now we're getting specific. We're saying the one that walks on all 4s, those which have jointed legs above their feet with which to leap on the earth. These you may eat, the locust after its kind, the destroying locust after its kind, the cricket after its kind, the grasshopper after its kind. But other flying insects which you have 4 feet shall be an abomination unto you." So again, do I have a problem as a Christian or a scientist in looking at those passages? Absolutely not. We then go to unclean animals, starting in verse 24.
Brad,
Yeah.
somebody's rubbing on the microphone. Yeah.
I'm good on my end.
Whatever you were moving there was rubbing on the microphone. Yeah.
All right. Starting in verse 24, we got unclean animals. I want you to notice, look specifically with me at verse 32 and 33. Anything on which any of them falls, when they are dead, shall be unclean, whether it is any item of wood or clothing or skin or sack, whatever item it is in which any work is done, it must be put in water, and it shall be unclean until evening. Then it shall be clean. Any earthen vessel into which any of them falls, you shall break, and whatever it is in them shall be unclean. Now it's talking specifically, you got to back up to verse 31. These are unclean to you among all that creep. Whoever touches them when they are dead shall be unclean until evening. It's talking specifically here about carcasses, about dead animals. Why is this a big deal?
Health problem.
What?
It can be a health issue.
It's definitely a health issue, but why is it a big deal to us today as far as being defenders of God's truth? Guys, he's telling them not just don't eat the dead carcass. Don't eat the nasty roadkill on the side of the road, but also if that roadkill touches one of your pots, you break the pot. Why is that a big deal? Contamination. But here's the point. We didn't know about bacteria until 1677. Okay? We're going to talk some later on about the fact you've got a guy by the name of Anton von Leeuwenhoek who made a microscope in 1677. He looks through it. He sees these things swimming around. That was in 1677. It wasn't until the 1860s when Louis Pasteur realized that those bugs, the bacteria, could actually cause disease and death. 1860. You realize some of your great-grandparents were living back then? That's when we learned that bacteria can cause disease. And yet the Bible was translated in 1611 into English, and already God is telling these people, look, if you got a dead possum and you accidentally toss that thing in your favorite Pyrex dish, just go and get rid of the dish, because that's nasty. All right. Any comments or questions through the end of chapter 11? Again, what we're doing here, guys, you remember, we're no longer looking at this from a historical perspective. Now what we're doing is we're zooming in and we're opening up, looking at some of the characteristics of God, and we're establishing a method of worship. And that main characteristic that we're examining all throughout the book of Exodus is the holiness of God. In order to be in His camp, in order to be His chosen people, we got to be clean. Now, these are the steps you've got to take in order to be clean. Chapter 12 deals with the ritual after childbirth, talking about ladies who need to remain unclean for a certain period of time after childbirth. 2 points I would make here. Number one, the primary issue on this one is a blood issue. It's not the infant. The infant is not the uncleanness. It's actually the blood and the discharge that cause the uncleanliness. Number two, there's a difference between how long the woman is to be unclean with a male child versus a female child.
One was 33 days and the other was 66 days, is that correct?
That's right. Why do you think that is?
Well, the male was the 33 days and the female was 66 days. I guess I'm not sure why that is.
Okay. Anybody got a reasonable answer?
Does it have to do with the male circumcision?
Nope. Sorry. Circumcision, remember, is on day 8, and it's not applicable to the woman's cleanliness. 2 things. Number one, most scholars would point out that this is giving credence to a man's status, so to speak. I don't necessarily buy that as much. I think the true reason is number 2, and that is there has been some pretty good scientific evidence, pretty good research showing that ladies after childbirth, believe it or not, they really do have more of a discharge after having a female infant than they do having a male. And that God was wanting a woman to wait for 2 full menstrual cycles after that, or what would be 2 menstrual cycles, two phases or 2 periods, in order to try to get themselves clean before entering back into the camp. Comments, thoughts, questions before we get on to leprosy. Is leprosy real?
Yes.
Yeah, it's actually still around today. There are not many cases of it, but there are still, in some areas, there are still some cases. Unfortunately, what we've done today in the medical community is we've given it other names rather than leprosy, and so it's really hard if you try to go and you do a medical research, like doing a database PubMed research on leprosy, you've got to use specific medical terms because generic terms like leprosy are not used in the community much anymore. Everybody here knows, hopefully, that one of the prime characteristics or attributes of leprosy was for somebody to turn white. Obviously, they would have known this because what was one of the ways that God proved to Moses that he was God? What did he ask him to do?
Stick his hand in his coat.
Stick his hand in his coat. Now, remember, guys, during this time, leprosy, you didn't have a cure for it. So when Moses brings his hand out and it's white, realistically, he's kind of thinking, okay, I'm through there. We're done. He sticks it back, and lo and behold, he's healed. So that is a true miracle. That's miraculous. These folks had to pronounce themselves unclean. Look, for instance, at verse 13. Back up in verse 12. If leprosy breaks out over all the skin, the leprosy covers all of the skin of the one who has a sore from his head to his foot, wherever the priest looks. The priest shall consider, and indeed if the leprosy has covered all of his body, he shall pronounce him clean who has the sore. It is turned white, he is clean. But when the raw flesh appears on him, he shall be unclean. And the priest shall examine the raw flesh, pronounce him unclean, for the raw flesh is unclean, it is leprosy. Or if the raw flesh changes and turns to white again, he shall come to the priest. The priest shall examine him, and indeed if the sore is turned white, then the priest shall pronounce him clean. Who has the sore, he is clean. If the body develops a boil in the skin and it is healed, and in the place of the boil there comes a white swelling or a bright spot, reddish white, then it shall be shown to the priest. And if the priest, when the priest sees it, indeed appears deeper than the skin, and hairs turned white, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. Part of your job as a preacher back then, you would have gotten to look at some really nasty sores. And that was part of it. Not only were you a butcher, you were also basically a side physician, and you got to look at whether or not discharges were clear, whether or not somebody's hair from their sore was white, or whether it was brown hair coming out of a mole or a wart. You got some really cool part of the job right there. You guys remember they were to put their finger over their lip, pronounce themselves unclean. Again, we think of that as odd, but from a strictly a hygienic perspective, what they were doing, guys, it was the first time in a nation's history where bacteria and quarantine kind of situations were being upheld. So God was telling these people, look, here is how we can keep the camp clean. Starting in verse 47, it talks about the leprous garments. Not only were the people unclean, you got to consider the garments as well. Chapter 14 is a ritual for cleansing healed lepers. And again, we go into great detail about washing their clothes, what parts should be washed, what the priest says. For instance, starting in verse 6. As for the living bird, he shall take it, the cedar wood, the scarlet, and the hyssop, dip them and the living bird in the blood of the bird that was killed over the running water. He shall sprinkle it 7 times on him who is to be cleansed from leprosy. Shall pronounce him clean, and shall let the living bird loose in the open field. He who is to be cleansed shall wash his clothes, shave off all of his hair, wash himself in water, that he may be clean. After that he may come out into the camp, and shall stay outside his tent for 7 days. But on the 7th day he shall shave all of his hair off his head, and his beard, his eyebrows, all of his hair he shall shave off. He shall wash his clothes, wash his body in water, and shall be clean. Now again, to a people today, we read that and that's not a big deal, but you got to remember, guys, this was before they even knew what a bacteria was. And this is basically God's way of saying, if you've got any kind of critters growing on you, here's what I want you to do. We're going to go through this ritual. Not only are we going to pronounce you clean, you're then going to shave yourself. You're going to remain outside of your tent, which may have these bacteria in it, for 7 days. And then at the end of that 7 days, I want you to reshave yourself to make sure that whatever it was is off of you.
Brad, is the shaving to sort of cut down on lice and things like that? Any other bugs that might have been carrying?
Two things. Number one, it's an outward sign to other people that this person is going through a cleansing process. But it's also to make sure that there is not a nesting site for bacteria.
Yeah. The other thing I was wondering is, would it be possible to have, say, signs of leprosy underneath your hair or something like that might be hidden, and after you shaved, it would become clear that, oh yes, you're still infected? Or
Absolutely, right.
Yeah.
I mean, you think about it, you want to get rid of this completely, and if you've got part of your bodies that are covered, then how do you know for sure whether or not you are completely cleansed? I don't think you guys can appreciate truly what God is doing to this group of people. You're talking about a time in which medicine was not known, and yet He has started, this is literally the beginning of advice, medical advice, that he's giving them that deep down would make no sense to them at all. It would kind of be like you guys coming up telling me, hey, I've got acid reflux, and I tell you, okay, go dip your head in the toilet 3 times. You would think I was nuts. Only to find out thousands of years later that maybe there's something in that toilet water that fixes acid reflux. Don't do that, by the way, Chris.
I always understood that leprosy, once you had it, you had it. I mean, and it comes across as if there is a chance you could heal from it. Is that true?
I always thought that could be mistaken diagnosis. You know, there's a lot of things that look suspicious. The average doctor might have to lop off 100 suspicious-looking sores to find a cancer. That's round about the stats in New Zealand, is that you find anywhere between 10 or maybe only 1% of what you remove from someone turns out to actually be in any way dangerous.
Right.
So, or
well,
very threatening. Yeah.
How do you know the difference between a rash that you were born with, a rash that you developed from an allergic reaction, a leprosy type rash, or an abrasion? The way that you do it is you go through these steps. You go through a period where the priest analyzes the edges. He looks at the hair. He looks at all of these factors. You then go through a period of healing to see if, okay, is it going to come back? Is it going to get worse? Is it going to deepen? Is it going to have a discharge? They come back, there's a reevaluation process, at which point then the priest is able to say, okay, that's either growing and it's leprous, or that was just simply a rash that, you know, basically is no big deal. Keely.
Doesn't it later make a distinction, though, between leprosy and skin disease?
Oh, yeah. I mean, he is going to start giving them all kinds of medical advice. And if you've ever seen somebody that was leprous, you know, if you were to ask me, Brad, can you tell the difference between leprosy and a rash? I can do it pretty quickly. But if you were to ask me, Brad, can you tell the difference between a genetic melanin disorder and leprosy? Well, then I'm going to have to take a little more time, and I'm going to have to think about it and look at it and examine it a lot closer to see if it's growing, or is that a melanin issue in that person's skin. How many of you in there have seen somebody that has, for instance, maybe they are a dark-skinned person, but they have massive blotches of white? You ever seen that? You know what I'm talking about? Okay. That is a genetic mutation that deals with their production of melanin. Now, if that same person were to come to a priest, he's got to be able to look at that and say, okay, is that leprosy or is that something else? What we'll do is we're going to isolate you and we're going to examine this. We're going to watch it and see if it grows, if it spreads, if it discharges, to see if that's leprosy or if that's something else. That makes sense. Now again, why all the hubbub about this anyway? What's the big deal?
Contagious.
Contagious. But what are we trying to do to the camp?
Separating us.
Camp's got to be clean. Remember, guys, the 3 boxes. You've got the non-Israelites who are unclean. Outside the camp is a place where people go when they're unclean. Inside the camp, folks are supposed to be clean. And that's where the Israelites were supposed to remain. Now, over and over again, you're going to see instructions of, for instance, if you are a lady who is having a menstrual cycle, you're to go outside the camp. Or if there's a blood issue, you go outside the camp. There's several examples where you go from the outer box, or the one of the inner boxes to the outer box. But the point is, he's trying to keep that inner box clean. And the most inner box is not to just be clean, is to be holy. Other comments, thoughts, questions? Yes, sir.
So, if they tripped and got a massive cut, and even though it wasn't really life-threatening or anything, if it was shooting out masses of blood, like it hit an artery or something, would they be considered unclean?
Yes. Because blood. And because if you look through the Old Testament text, guys, even though they did not know about bacteria, God was giving them instructions as if they did. I mean, he is telling them not only is the person unclean, their garments are unclean, the containers that were open are unclean. It's to me, it's one of the most awesome examples of scientific foreknowledge that exists. If you guys have never read, there's a book called None of These Diseases by S.I. McMillan. If you haven't read it, you need to get a copy of it, and I'm being very serious. There's a new edition of it out right now that's got S.I. McMillan, and I think his son has kind of come back and tried to profit off of it. Basically, he's republished it under both their names, but the original book is just phenomenal in outlining the medical advice God was giving the Israelites and what we know about it today. Jared?
No, just sore shoulder. Sorry.
Okay. Well, you know, if you will follow this book, Jared, if you'll follow all the instructions here,
Yeah.
then your shoulder won't hurt as bad.
All right. Thanks, Greg.
Again, the laws concerning leprous houses, starting in verse 33. So here's the thing. Again, understand that today a preacher's job is to preach the gospel. Back then, a priest's job was to try to preserve cleanliness and holiness. And so part of your job would be to go to houses and to look and see, is there a discharge on the wall? Is there something growing? Is there bacteria and fungus and nastiness? Thankfully, today you don't have to do that. Today, all you have to do is eat somebody's fellowship meal that may have something growing in it. I'll share this with you real quick. We had a fellowship meal. We had a lady who was in her 80s, precious woman. She wanted to bring one of the turkeys for a fellowship meal. This happened to be in November. And it looked beyond beautiful. It was one of those perfectly golden, juicy kind of thing. They took an electric knife. They were in the kitchen of this particular church building. Take an electric knife. They're cutting it. They get into the actual meat, and it was frozen. Yeah, she cooked it for like an hour. Yeah. What do you do then? Knowing that bird is like raw on the inside.
Accidentally knocked off the table.
We very nicely put other turkey on a platter and let hers go away. All right. Chapter 15, the law concerning bodily discharges. Somebody tell me, before we go into specifics about this, why, just from the outset, why would discharges, what's the big deal? Why would God even be specifying anything about this?
Infectious.
Major breeding ground for bacteria, guys. If you think about most of the common bacteria that we have today, there are certain fluids that are the perfect temperature because they've been in your body. A lot of them have the perfect nutrients, whether it be sugars, whether it be the right acidity. You're talking about the prime environment. Obviously, we don't like to talk about bodily discharges much, but I'm trying to convey to you guys the fact that this would have been foreign to them back then because they didn't understand the whole concept that particular fluid, whatever it be, was the perfect environment as a host for bacteria. Verse 2 says, "Speak to the children of Israel, say to them, when any man has a discharge from his body, his discharge is unclean. This shall be his uncleanness in regard to his discharge, whether his body runs with his discharge or his body is stopped up by his discharge, it is his uncleanness. Every bed is unclean on which he who has had his discharge lies. Everything in which he sits shall be unclean. Whoever touches his bed shall wash his clothes and bathe in his water and be unclean until evening." There are a lot of people who assume that this is strictly talking about semen or that type of discharge. That's while that may be part of the case, that's not strictly the case, because if you look at the text itself and you go back to the original, it is talking about a running discharge or a stopped up discharge, which is probably better parlayed as a scab. I know some of you guys have probably had some pretty good scabs that ooze and some that dry up and are crusty. That's kind of what we're getting at here. If you've ever had a blister that has pus coming out of it, that's part of what we're talking about here. Picking up in verse 5, "Whoever touches his bed shall wash his clothes, bathe in water, be unclean until evening. He who sits on anything on which who has the discharge sat shall wash his clothes, bathe in water, be unclean until evening. He who touches the body of him who has the discharge shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until evening." The other thing that scholars have pointed out, what was a major physiological problem of people back then as far as a sickness? Ooh, y'all should know this. What were people suffering from a lot back then?
Vitamin C deficiency.
Okay. What else?
I'm good to go with something.
Do what?
Dysentery.
I think you said it.
Water, not washing properly.
Yeah. They didn't have water, which causes what? Dysentery, guys. It's called the Mexican foxtrot. Don't drink the water. If you've got water that's got bacteria in it, it's going to cause all kinds of issues, one of which would obviously be a pretty steady discharge from your body.
So that would be why you couldn't sit on anything that he sat on?
Precisely.
Is that where we were going with that?
That's part of it, yes. I mean, you got to understand that here again, all of these things are going to be containing bacteria, and God is trying to keep the camp clean. Verse 8, "If he who has the discharge spits on him who is clean, then he shall wash his clothes, bathe in water, be unclean until evening." Why is that a big deal? Well, if somebody's got a discharge, let's say you've cut open your leg and you were out trying to get food for the Israelite camp. You cut your leg open, it's oozing, it's setting up a bacteria, you may have a gangrene infection. If you spit, there's a possibility that you have what in your saliva? Bacteria. So even before they knew what a bacteria was, God's saying, look, if dude spits on you, not only is that just nasty, you need to go on and get cleaned up, because it could have something in it. "Any saddle on which he who has the discharge rides shall be unclean. Whoever touches anything that was under him shall be unclean until evening. He who carries any of those things shall wash his clothes, bathe in water, be unclean until evening. Whoever the one who has discharge touches and has not rinsed his hands in water, he shall wash his clothes, bathe in water, and be unclean until evening." Again, the idea of washing in water, washing your hands, bathing. You know, we know today the big thing is swine flu. The number one defense against the swine flu is washing your hands. You know, here we are literally probably 2,500 years before the germ theory of disease, and God is telling these people, wash your hands, wash your stuff. Don't be nasty. You know, don't touch something that's unclean and then go stick it in your mouth. Any thoughts, comments, or questions?
So they really had no idea. So they would think, oh, here's some religious law we've got to follow now. We've got to go wash our hands and bathe in the river. People didn't take baths back then, right? So they had no idea that was actually doing anything for them.
They didn't take baths as often as we do today. They were definitely not as, from a cultural perspective, hopefully you guys are bathing about every other day or every day. But they did not. They would not. Besides the fact that, think about this. Did they have clean, chlorinated water? We know today why you don't take a cow and why you take a cow upstream to drink, right? Everybody understands that? If the cows are all out in the water and doing stuff, that means they've probably done something in the water, so you take them upstream to drink. Well, we know about that today. We understand. We know about clean water. We have piped water in our homes. They didn't back then. Starting in verse 15, the priest shall offer them. The one is a sin offering, the other is a burnt offering. So the priest shall make atonement for him before the Lord because of his discharge. So, again, somebody that is unclean is not prepared to be in the presence of the Lord. Verse 16, if any man has an emission of semen, then he shall wash all of his body in water, be unclean until evening. Any garment, leather on it, in which there is semen, it should be washed with water and unclean. Also, when a woman lies with a man, there is an emission of semen, they shall bathe in water and be shall unclean until evening. If a woman has a discharge, shall discharge from her body his blood, be set apart for 7 days. Whoever touches her shall be unclean until evening. Everything that she lies on during her impurity shall be unclean. So again, very specific, detailed instructions about how we were to deal with those kinds of issues. Again, it's to me, it's pretty fascinating in that when you look at the culture back then, and I'm not going to be crude, but I want y'all to think about this for a moment. Ladies back then did not have the products that we have today that allow them to be clean like they can be today. And so God basically here is saying, look, if during a menstrual cycle, you need to remain, you need to cleanse yourself. You need to purify yourself. So for 7 days, you're outside the camp until you can then be clean and come back inside the camp. We think of that as weird, but we got to remember they didn't have all the niceties of life that we have today. Questions, comments? All right, guys. Y'all have a great afternoon. I will see you on Thursday.